I wasn't sure if I wanted the thing or if it would even fit in the car, but I knew my husband Sean would want it. He had started a DIY YouTube channel about restoring old furniture he'd find at garage sales or on the side of the road. I was finally developing an eye for the kinds of pieces he liked to feature, and this was definitely something he'd like. It was an old-school vanity with a matching chair, the kind where you'd sit and put on makeup or do your hair. I was surprised nobody had come along and picked it up. Being a good urban termite means being in the right place at the right time. I pulled the thing to the curb, leaned it over the edge of my trunk, and pushed. It was real wood, which meant it was antique for sure. My husband was going to love working on this one. I stuffed the chair into the remaining space in my trunk. I closed the door and looked up at the house. This was a nice neighborhood, full of older, established homes. Nothing like our small house on the edge of town. But this one was overgrown and tired looking. It looked empty, really. Maybe somebody had passed on and there had been an estate sale. The vanity may have been left over and not worth the trouble of selling elsewhere. It's always strange to me when people discard things that have value. I grew up poor and have always struggled to make ends meet. We don't throw things away. We find uses for them or modify them or another purpose. Hence the DIY channel. I drove to our house and pulled the vanity and chair from the car and brought it indoors. The only space we had for it in our small house was in the bedroom. I put it against the wall facing the bed. When my husband came home and saw it, he was impressed. It was a beautiful set. He was also amazed that someone had tossed out what looked like a valuable antique. That night, I looked at the vanity before going to sleep. It felt out of place in our house. It was far fancier than anything we would have been able to afford, and I went to sleep happy I'd found it. A few hours later, I woke up to feel my husband grabbing my arm tightly. His grip was so tight, I almost didn't hear the creaking sound. I turned over to see him wide-eyed, leaning far back towards the headboard. He was staring straight ahead. I turned towards the sound of the wooden vanity at our feet to see something climbing out of the mirror and onto the floor. It was twisting and contorting. We could hear its limbs dragging on the floor and felt the push as its hands clutched the edge of our blankets. As it rose at the foot of the bed, we could see her more clearly now. The grotesque figure was a ghost-like rotting woman, her decaying flesh hanging from her bones in tattered shreds. The stench of decay was suffocating. Her empty eyes fixed on me, then my husband. We were paralyzed, all our muscles tense, but still unable to move. She lurched sideways and dragged herself towards the open bedroom door. We watched her take 3 slow steps into the dark hallway, and then everything went silent. We scrambled from the bed, my husband running towards the door. He looked down the short hallway to the front door. There was nothing there. We turned all the lights on in the house and searched together. Whatever she was, whatever she wanted, she was gone now. We hauled the vanity onto the curb that night. It was gone by morning. When I was 10, I started letting myself in after school because my parents finished work at 4 and I got home around 2:45. I was always a responsible kid, and I would make myself a snack and then start my homework. I was allowed to game after finishing my homework if I was done before dinner. Since being left alone in the house, I've heard a voice calling my name from my grandmother's old bedroom. She lived with us until she had to go into hospice care before she passed. We were very close, and I miss her terribly. I thought maybe I was imagining her voice because I missed her so much. When I first heard it, it was comforting, familiar, but then it seemed to change. Now the voice coming from her bedroom is strange, like my grandmother's, but more like a deep echo. I was too scared to go into her old room while I was home alone. I never heard the voice when my mom and dad were home, only when I was alone. I asked my parents if they ever heard voices in the house, and they looked at me funny and said no. Sometimes when I hear the voice, I go to her room and stand outside with my ear to the door, listening. It gets very quiet, and there's no movement sounds. As I listen, with my face pressed against the door, I'll hear my name again, and now it's just inches away from me on the other side of that thin door. I jump and run across the hall to my room. My grandmother was one of the kindest people I've ever known, so it didn't make sense to me that she'd do anything to scare me. I kept thinking about her and wished I knew why she was calling to me. It reminded me of when I was very young, we'd play hide and seek together. I thought to myself that maybe it was some sort of game like that. The next time I was alone and heard the voice calling my name, I went down the hall and leaned against the door, my ear pressed close, listening. "Come and find me." The voice crept from the other side, eerily drawing me in, as if it was imitating something human. The words hung in the air, sending shivers down my spine. I turned and ran back across the hallway to my room, closing my door until my parents came home. After a few months of hearing this voice coming from inside my grandmother's old bedroom, I finally worked up the courage to go into the room. I needed to know why she was calling me. I was still scared, so I waited until my family was home to do it. I was getting ready for bed, and I could hear my parents talking downstairs. I walked across the hallway from my bedroom and put my hand on the doorknob. My hand was so sweaty, I almost couldn't turn the knob. I inched the door open and reached for the light switch. I opened the door about halfway and saw all my grandmother's things. My mom still hadn't packed them up. She was still heartbroken too. I stepped inside and saw her old soft blanket at the foot of her bed and the jigsaw puzzle she had been working on before she got sick. There were no voices here now, just memories. I started crying softly and sat on her bed. I could still smell her perfume in the room, and I closed my eyes and put my head in my hands. I really missed her. After a few minutes, I got off the bed and went to the door, and as I reached for the light switch, the closet caught my eye. It was open, but it had been closed when I entered the room. I quickly shut the door and went back to my room across the hall. I closed my door and crawled into bed. I could hear the muffled sounds of my parents talking downstairs. And then another sound. The voice from the bedroom was here, in my room, and it was calling me to follow. I looked up to see the closet door opening slowly. What came out was not my grandmother. The house I grew up in is near an active railroad track. The train is loud, and we were used to it, but the things we heard and saw when the trains weren't running through there were far worse. If you've ever looked down an empty train track, it seems innocuous. But when there's no train, the tracks are an open route for people to use for foot travel or for shady things like drug deals or worse. People have even reported seeing bodies there, but the police never found any bodies. A few years before I was born, there was a train accident about a half-mile from my house. It was a nighttime collision that resulted in 6 deaths. There were rumors that the area was haunted, and as kids, we used to sneak out at night with our flashlights and ghost hunt, and look for crime scenes or bodies. We were weird kids. Of course, this was incredibly dangerous, not only because trains would run through regularly, but also because quite often we'd run into other trespassers, hanging out or sleeping on the edge of the tracks. As kids, we had no business being there, but we went anyway, usually just scaring the hell out of ourselves and telling ghost stories. Until one night. As usual, we told our parents we were spending the night at each other's houses, and I met my friend Tanya at the end of my street before we climbed under the fence into the train tracks. We had a little meeting spot to sit and talk, carved out in the brush against the fence, but not visible from our street. Tanya had a little flashlight for emergencies, but we didn't want anyone to see us, so we rarely used it. That night, we decided to walk the tracks and headed away from our spot. We had walked about a mile when it started to rain. It was the steady kind of rain that seemed like it would last. So we turned around and started heading back. That's when we heard something behind us, something moving fast. The incoming train warning bells and lights were off, so we knew it wasn't a train, but we looked at each other and started running anyway. Looking back, there was only darkness and a deafening roar piercing the air. It was gaining on us, and the sound was all around us. A second later, something roared past us in the night, nothing we could see, only hear and feel. The ground quaked beneath our feet as a cold rush of air blasted past us. It was a phantom locomotive racing, leaving us crouched down and shaking. We looked at each other, now frozen in place. A second later, we heard a deafening crash, and then everything fell silent, except for the rain hitting the ground and the tracks in front of us. We knew we had just experienced the ghost train. Terrified, we ran all the way back to our spot near the fence. As we approached it, we saw the shapes of some homeless people sleeping near our little hiding spot. I motioned for Tanya to leave them alone, but she had left her bag there, and she needed her keys. We walked quietly around the sleeping figures, and she picked up her backpack. We turned and saw their faces for the first time. They were not alive. These people were mangled and not breathing. Their eyes stared blankly, their faces and bodies destroyed. We ran all the way back to Tanya's house. Now we understood why the police never found any bodies. I used to take the 12B train home from work every evening. My stop is near the end of the line, and usually there are just a handful of people still riding when I reach it. I had been struggling with some issues at the time, both personal and work-related, and I was lost in thought, staring out the window as the train lurched closer to my stop. I was seriously feeling stuck in my job and needed to make a change. 2 stops before mine, an elderly man who was sitting across from me suddenly turned in my direction and smiled. I hadn't been focusing on anyone in particular, but the intensity and directness of his smile couldn't be ignored. I smiled back awkwardly and he continued to smile at me, and then at other passengers. I pulled out my phone to discourage him and scrolled until I heard my stop announced. I got off the subway and walked to my condo with a clouded head. Indecision was frustrating, and I made myself focus on dinner first. Okay, I decided on spaghetti. I pulled out the ingredients and put some water on to boil. That one decision led to the next one. Right then and there, I decided I was going to send my resume out to find a new job. As the water boiled, I popped open my laptop and quickly updated my resume. I was lost in the job search when I heard the hiss of the water boiling onto the burner. I looked towards my kitchen and saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. I live alone and don't have pets. I stood up and waited, listening. I only heard the water hissing on the burner and quickly went to turn it off. I winced as some water bubbled over and splashed onto my hand. I grabbed the biggest knife I had and peered around the corner of the hallway. Of course, there was nothing there, and I laughed at myself for being so jumpy. I made my dinner and felt pretty good about having made the decision to send my resume out. It was well past time for a change, and relocating could be even more exciting. I looked around my condo with fresh eyes and saw the paint cans in the corner. I had bought 2 colors, a dusty green and a sunny yellow, but I'd put off deciding which to use on an accent wall. I'd been feeling so unmotivated and frustrated, but tonight had changed all that. I grabbed the yellow paint and a brush and got to work adding some freshness to the drab space. On my way home the next evening, I still felt excited about the changes I'd made. There's something so freeing about knowing you're potentially in your last few weeks or months of a job that you hate. I had been checking my email on my phone when I realized I was alone on the subway. Alone, except for the old man from the night before. He was smiling at me again. He stood up slowly and walked the length of the subway car to sit in the seat perpendicular to me, just 1 seat away. He kept smiling the whole time. I really didn't want to talk to him, but I also hate confrontation. I desperately wanted my stop to be next. He settled into his seat and leaned towards me, still smiling, motioning for me to lean towards him. I did, and his smile grew. His head turned up towards mine. He was too close, and I wanted to move, but instead I just turned my ear towards him as he started to speak. "I'm sorry I made you burn your hand." Confused, I thought for a second. Then I remembered the pasta water, and yellow was the right choice. It gives you a warm glow when you sleep. I watched as his face became more wrinkled and sallow. His skin was loose and stretching. I turned away to move and felt his hands on my arms, unexpectedly strong. My eyes widened with terror, and there it was, his monstrously large mouth slowly opening inches from mine. His elongated teeth glinted in the dim, flickering subway light, razor sharp and ready to sink into my flesh. His horrible eyes were fixed on me with a predatory stare. As his teeth tore into my throat, indecision fell away. The world narrowed to a single, clear point. This old man was not a man at all. My family just moved into a newly built house after always living in apartments. My sister and I were getting our own rooms for the first time, so the change was a big deal for us. At bedtime, on that first night, my dad tucked me in first and turned to leave the room. As I watched him go, I saw something behind him that was shadowing his movements. It was shaped like him, but dark, like a full-body misty shadow. As he left and shut the door behind him, I watched it slip through the door and leave. It was one of those moments when you're not sure if what you just saw was real or not. I rubbed my eyes and snuggled into my blanket, assuming I'd just imagined it. I was so tired from the move, I went right to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened, but this time, as my dad was leaving with the shadow following, I asked him if he could leave the door open a crack, and he did. I thought maybe it would be better to have a little light coming through the door as I fell asleep. I watched as my dad pulled the door almost completely closed, leaving it open just a few inches, allowing the dim light from the hallway to stream into my room. He turned, and I heard him walk down the hallway to my sister's room. I was already dozing off when I heard him close my sister's door and retreat down the hallway. As his feet hit the stairs, the light from the hallway disappeared. I opened my eyes to see the shadow at the crack in my door. It stood motionless. If it had a face, it would be staring at me. I pulled the covers over my head and listened, but no sounds came from the hallway. Without looking, I knew it was still there, watching me. I could feel it watching me. I remember being relieved that at least it was outside my door and not in here with me. I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, it was morning, and the sun was shining in through my window, and there were no shadows anywhere. At breakfast, I thought about asking my sister if she had seen anything, but if she hadn't, I knew she would make fun of me, so I didn't mention it. The next night, when my dad tucked me in, I watched as the shadow followed behind him like it had the last 2 nights. As my dad reached the door, I asked him to close it all the way this time, and he nodded. Then my dad continued through the door, but the shadow was motionless. With the last seconds of light streaming through the closed door, I saw the shadow turn and face me. With the click of the door, it was sealed in my room with me in the darkness. It loomed by the door, facing my bed. Its dark shape sucked all the light from my room. I could feel it watching me. I couldn't leave unless I got out of bed and ran straight through it, so I pulled the covers over my head again. The room was silent except for my breathing. I felt hot tears trickle down my face, but there were no other sounds beyond my bed. I don't know when I fell asleep, but again, the sunshine through my window woke me up. I was still under my covers, so I knew it had happened. It wasn't just a nightmare I could explain away. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I don't want to sleep in my room tonight. I'm not going back to my apartment. I've been living with my parents for 2 weeks because I won't go back there alone. When I moved in, everything was fine. Weird things happened, but I could explain them away. At the very beginning, I didn't even realize things were happening because I work so much. I was only in this apartment to sleep, and that was about it. I ate at work or after work before coming home and spent time at the gym or with my friends. One night, as I was brushing my teeth before bed, I leaned backwards from my bathroom sink. As I did, the bathroom door suddenly swung shut, cracking my elbow as it slammed closed. There was no explanation for it closing, and especially for how fast and violently it had closed. There were no open windows. Nothing had fallen behind the door to push it with such force. I stood staring into my bathroom mirror at the space behind me, watching blood trickle down my elbow from where it had hit me. I half expected to see someone standing there, but of course I was alone in my little apartment. After that incident, doors started closing and opening frequently. I had a sliding glass door in my living room that I kept locked. I know it was locked because I always check the locks on my front door and the slider before bed. As I turned off my tableside lamp and the room went dark, the glass door slid open. My head snapped around and I stood frozen, watching the open glass door leading into the darkness of my small, empty patio. I turned the light back on and tried to make sense of what had just happened, but I couldn't. I locked the door again and closed the curtains. There must be some rational explanation for what I had just seen, but I couldn't find one. Over the next month, more strange things like this happened. But I didn't have time to think about it. Work had kept me busy, and I was hoping to move into a promotion soon. But that changed 2 weeks ago. I was sitting in my living room, in a chair facing the sliding glass door, with my back to the rest of the room. I was scrolling through my phone, leaning forward, when suddenly my head was yanked back tight against the back of the chair. My forehead felt like there was a thick rope lashed against it, and my head slammed back against the chair so hard I got lightheaded. As my arms flailed backwards, I dropped my phone hard on the floor somewhere to my right. I reached behind me, trying to loosen the rope, but there was no rope I could feel with my hands, and I watched myself fight something powerful and cruel in the reflection in front of me. But there was nothing I could see, just my own terrified face pressed backwards. I was pinned there, helpless, and unable to get my feet under me to get away. As suddenly as the attack started, I was free. I pushed away from the chair and turned, but there was nothing there to see. I knew I wasn't alone. I knew something was there, but I couldn't see it. I grabbed my phone and bag and drove to my parents' house an hour away. My lease is up in 2 months, and I won't go back there alone. My house borders a narrow wooded area, with another neighborhood just beyond it. My backyard slopes down about a foot, and I have a fence around it. There's a gate at the far end of the fence where it slopes. When I moved to Florida and into this house, I imagined creating an outdoor patio oasis with space to have friends over and relax. The house has big glass doors that face the yard, and the backyard was going to be a natural extension of the house. I even took the blinds down, feeling secure with the fence and the wooded area as a buffer for anyone looking in. But that first week I moved in, everything changed. My home office faces the yard, and just before wrapping up for the day, I looked up from my monitor, and I saw a head at the fence. It was pale, almost gray, and I couldn't make out the shape of the face very well, like it was diluted or blurry. I put my glasses on to see better, but it was gone. It scared me, but I half thought I had imagined it because my fence is taller at the back to compensate for the downward slope of the property. There's no way anybody could be that tall. I watched the fence line for a few seconds, and when nothing happened, I stood up to turn off the light in the room as it was getting dark out, and I was now clearly visible. When I turned back around, it was there again, but it stayed there, watching me from above the fence. It had no hair, just pale gray skin, and dark holes where eyes should have been. It almost looked like someone was wearing a mask. I reached for my phone, looking away for just an instant, but when I looked back up, it was gone. I got up and walked to the far end of my house where it was darkest, where I thought I wouldn't be seen from the yard. I watched the fence for a few more minutes, but when nothing happened, I assumed it was some kids from the next neighborhood trying to freak me out. I put the blinds back up the next morning and kept them open just enough to let some light in. I periodically checked the fence line, but saw nothing. That afternoon, I was on a video call and looked up to see the head was there again, watching me. I must have looked shocked because my coworker asked me what was wrong. I looked back at the meeting, and then it was gone again. I checked the gate at the back of the fence. It was unlocked, which is not how I left it. It can only easily be unlocked from the inside, so someone had to work to get it open. While I was back there, I stepped through the gate beyond the fence, something I hadn't thought to do before buying the house. I had to be careful walking through the overgrown brush on the ground, and I kept an eye out for snakes or red ants. That's when I noticed the barbed wire. There were thick double coils of it extending along the full length of my property fence at knee level. I almost ran right into it. There were big palm fronds and piles of leaves and other debris covering the coils, as though someone had wanted to hide it. I don't know why it was put there, but I know for sure that whatever was watching me over that fence would have been standing right where the barbed wire was, and that would have been impossible without getting badly injured. I have cameras on order, and my backyard plans are going to have to wait until I figure out what's been watching me. I'll update when I know more. I live close to my grandma's house, just outside of Lisbon, New Hampshire, which is a very small town near the Vermont line. When I was 16, she asked me to house sit while she went on vacation to Italy for 2 weeks with her friend. Nothing ever happens here, so she figured I could handle it. And I had just finished school for the summer, so I was the only one in my family with no plans. Her house is small, tucked against a steep hill on a quiet road most people don't bother to use. At the bend on her street is the old schoolhouse building. The town records are stored there now, and she's the part-time record keeper. There's very little traffic on her road, not only because it's a local road, but also because it's narrow as hell. There's a steep hill on one side, and a guardrail with a drop-off on the other side. It's very tight to get through there. I ask her all the time not to do it, but she always walks to work at the old schoolhouse, even in the winter when roads are icy. She says it's silly to drive just around the bend. On the second night I was house-sitting, I set up a patio chair in the front yard to have a smoke and a beer. It was still early in the summer, the perfect time of year here in New Hampshire. As I scrolled on my phone and popped my second beer, I heard a car drive past the house towards the schoolhouse. The radio was on, and I could hear a DJ's voice as it drove past. I looked up to just catch the taillights as they drove on. It was an antique pickup truck, which honestly isn't that strange here in the summer. Everyone wants to show off their old toys, now that the roads are finally clear of ice and snow. As it roared down the road, two shapes came into view in the columns of light made by the headlights cutting through the darkness. They were the shapes of two people, possibly two young women, walking in the dark and narrow street near the old schoolhouse. Before I had time to react, I heard the impact as the car struck them, and then watched in horror as the car disappeared around the bend. It was late in the night, and I was alone in the thick night air. Disgustedly, I hoped to hear cries or groans from the two still forms on the ground. But they were silent. The echo of the sickening impact hammered in my ears as I stared at the still silence that stretched far down the dark road. As I dialed 911 and struggled to keep my voice steady, describing what I'd seen, I didn't take my eyes off the two dark shapes, willing them to peel themselves off the pavement, but they remained motionless in the road. I knew they were gone. After ending the call, I approached the bodies with dread, slowly putting one foot in front of the other towards them. I didn't want to see the aftermath of such a violent moment, but also felt like I had to protect them, or at least mark the place where they lay for when the police arrived. I checked the time on my phone. It had only been 2 minutes since I disconnected. I was about 60 feet away when it started to rain. I shivered as the cool rain hit my arms and face, and my teeth chattered from the trauma of what I'd just seen. The rain was the only sound around me now. I stopped, too nervous to approach the bodies. A moment later, headlights shined towards me as the police turned the bend by the old schoolhouse and approached me. Waving to them, I signaled to the area and the road between us, but as my eyes followed my pointing arm, I stared in disbelief at the ground. The bodies were gone. I watched as the falling rain droplets filled the dry imprint of their shapes on the rain-soaked road. The dry void darkened as it filled. I watched all trace of them disappear. The sound of the police car doors closing snapped my attention back towards them, and I tried in vain to explain what I'd seen. They made a cursory check of the area, shining their flashlights down the embankment, but there was nothing to find. They warned me about making false police reports and left. I walked back to my grandma's house in a daze, trying to wrap my head around what I'd seen. As I closed the door behind me, I heard a car approach and turned to see the same antique pickup truck thundering past, the DJ's voice echoing in the darkness, cutting through the falling rain. My husband and I spent a week at our lakeside cabin in Michigan just before the holidays last year. The cabin is set back in the woods, cozy and rustic. It's our perfect holiday getaway. One night while we were there, my husband ran to the local grocery store before it closed to pick up supplies for dinner. The cabin has a large open picture window that faces the lake, and I watched as the first snow fell, shrouding the dark stretch from the cabin to the lake. Grabbing a blanket, I curled up in a chair by the window to watch TV. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up when my husband opened the front door with the groceries. The room was chilly, warmed by the last of the dying fire. Still wrapped in the blanket, I opened the back door which led towards the lake to replenish the firewood we stored in the woodshed. As I reached the firewood, I saw footprints in the snow. They led from the lake to the cabin window, and then from the cabin back down to the lake. Carrying the wood back inside, I asked my husband why he had gone to the lake, my head still foggy from just having woken up. He looked at me confused, and I explained about the footprints. We both went outside and checked them out, my husband following them to the lake's edge, which had a thin, undisturbed filament of ice covering its surface. We keep cameras on the exterior of the cabin for security reasons, and I ran back inside to check the feed. Just after my husband had left, a man wearing a white t-shirt and holding something in his hand had walked up to the window from the direction of the lake and stood watching me through the window for about 20 minutes. He then turned and walked back towards the lake and out of view of the camera. We zoomed the camera in and recognized the shape in his hand. He was holding a large hunting knife. Honestly, a part of me wonders if he was even human. It was freezing that night, and the footprints came from the lake and then seemed to have disappeared back into the lake. There was no break in the water's ice for a boat, and he wouldn't have been swimming in a t-shirt, not in that weather. To this day, I wonder how things could have ended differently that night if the man from the lake had broken that single pane of glass that stood between me and him. Call about an injured raccoon on a popular hiking trail. I gathered up my trapping gear and hiked into the area where the poor animal had been seen. I tracked it off trail into the woods and suddenly felt like there was someone behind me. Turning, I saw a woman with long blonde hair walking away from me towards the trail. Seeing someone here wasn't unusual, but it was odd that she had been off trail here out near me. I continued searching for the raccoon. After a few minutes, I looked up to see the woman in front of me, but this time she was peering at me from behind a tree. I must have been distracted and not seen or heard her double back towards me. I put my hand up to wave, and she slinked behind the tree. People can be odd, even intensely strange at times, but this was just really weird. I felt like I had to investigate, given that there was a missing woman out there. I approached the tree, giving it a wide berth, but when I reached it, there was nobody there. I could see a good distance in every direction, and she had just vanished. I eventually found the raccoon, trapped it, and put it in the bed of my truck. As I reached for the truck door, I heard a woman crying behind me. Turning, I saw the same woman running across the trail into the woods. She looked back at me, utterly terrified, tears streaming down her face. She was cradling her arm in her jacket. Something had gone wrong. I radioed for backup and was told they'd send help, but all hell had broken loose at the main campground. A man with a gun was pounding on doors, threatening people. They subdued him, and a search of his car revealed drugs, a saw, and a woman's hand. When the police came, we searched the woods in the direction I'd seen the woman run. The dogs found her behind a large fallen tree. Her long blonde hair was covered in leaves and debris, and she was missing her left hand. It was clear that she had died several days ago. The high school I attended was a small, private, all-girls Catholic school in a busy East Coast city. It was old and had a ton of history within its tall, brick-walled property. Before it was a high school, the grounds were near a large river where native people traveled and traded regularly. Later, the site became a convent, and those nuns created a school for girls. First as a boarding school, then later only a day school. The majority of my teachers were nuns, and I was there only a decade ago. As first-year freshmen, we were flooded with the school's haunted history by upperclassmen just wanting to creep out the younger students. There were reports of ghosts all over campus, from the large main historic building to the woods around the upper fields over the hill where our teams practiced. There was a short wooded path between the upper fields and the lower buildings, which also branched off towards a small chapel. The chapel's small convent graveyard was a favorite sneak-off spot for students looking to smoke, or scare themselves with ghost stories, or whatever they thought they'd be brave enough to find. But there was one story that stood out. In the 1950s, there were 3 boarding students that went missing, although at the time they were believed to have been runaways. But when a nun went missing, a young woman who had graduated from the school and then entered the convent, suspicions emerged. She'd been a smart student, often seen studying in the freshman locker room after school. The young nun's body was later found in the woods on campus, near the chapel, her head covered in a black cloth sack. A local man had been charged with her death and openly admitted to taking the lives of the 3 boarding students, but never revealed what had become of their bodies. They buried that young nun in the chapel graveyard, less than 100 feet where her body had been found. The man said he had been called to the campus by the devil. By late September of my freshman year, I hadn't seen anything to make me think the school was haunted. Not until this happened. The freshman lockers were in the basement of the main building, a massive rectangular room lined with rows of lockers on one side, and tables and chairs against the other. This is where we spent our downtime as freshmen between classes. On the far ends of this long room were the light switches that controlled all the overhead lights, and the older students warned us to keep the lights on after dark no matter what, and to never be in the basement alone at night. This was easier said than done, since all our after-school sports or clubs wrapped up well after dark here in New England. I played field hockey as a freshman, and after practice we'd stop back into the basement to grab our stuff from the locker room before leaving. I stayed late to practice my forehand shots at the net, and when my arms felt like noodles, I headed back to the main building for the rest of my stuff. It was full dark, and the short path through the woods gave me the creeps. I pulled out my earpods and felt worse, listening to the wind through the trees. I half jogged to the main building and flipped on the lights at the bottom of the basement stairs. Flipped them on, meaning I would be alone down there. My locker was about 20 feet from the bottom of the stairs, past 2 rows of lockers. As I grabbed my bag and closed my locker door, I felt myself rushing. I didn't know if it was going through the woods that night or all the stories I'd heard, but I really felt like I needed to get out of there. As I turned to walk to the end of my row of lockers, I heard something at the opposite end of the row. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see another student, but I didn't see anyone. I turned back, hoisting my heavy backpack over my shoulder, and the lights went out. Assuming someone had left and turned the lights off on their way out, I yelled, "Hey, I'm down here!" No sounds, just darkness. I felt my way to the end of the row of lockers and turned towards the stairs, and towards the light switches. In the total darkness, my knee crashed into something metal that scraped along the floor with the force of my forward movement. My foot caught it, forcing it to crash sideways as I fell face first on the hard ground, biting my lip. I could taste the blood before I knew what had happened. I struggled to my feet, desperately, feeling for my backpack that had launched over my head. I reached the light switch and turned it on, looking behind me towards where I had tripped. I saw my collapsed backpack, and beyond it, a single chair. The chair, which should have been on its side, was now upright, facing away from me, and there was a small nun sitting in it. Her back was to me, and she was facing forwards away from me. As my eyes adjusted and I picked up my backpack on the ground, I opened my mouth to say something when I realized she wasn't wearing the normal nun's black veil. She was wearing a black cloth sack over her head. I turned and ran up the stairs, feeling my skin crawl and my heart beating out of my chest. When I turned the corner of the stairs, the light was off again. I never told anyone what I had seen, but I was never alone in that basement again. After that incident, I was more careful about being alone, but sometimes it was impossible, or you'd just forget until something happened again to remind you, like this incident when I was a sophomore. The school's main building had a 4-story wooden staircase that was at least 15 feet wide. It was impressive, made of dark polished wood, and creaked and groaned with each step. It was easy to let your mind think about how creepy the building was, especially considering its violent past. One of my favorite teachers was both the English and the drama teacher, and our school put on 2 plays every year. Although I never wanted to be in a play myself, I knew she needed ushers on performance nights to help hand out playbills to the audience and to make sure people could navigate their way out of the second-floor theater auditorium to the bathrooms or down to the main floor exit. On the last night of the fall performance, we ran out of playbills about 30 minutes before the show. I knew there was an extra box of playbills on the 4th floor in my English teacher's classroom. I ran up the wide stairs and saw the box just inside her classroom door. Using the hallway light, I grabbed the box off her desk, but before I could turn around, the light faded and the heavy wooden door closed behind me. I turned fast, and using the dim evening light coming from the big window in the classroom, I saw something move near the door. I can only describe it as an inky shadow pressed against the back of the door. Time stopped as I held my breath in the silence, watching the dark mist glide away from the door towards the darkest corner of the room. I felt like it wanted to be seen, but not entirely. It stayed in the shadows away from the window light and then slowly seemed to melt into the wall. There was the eeriest feeling in the room, even worse than when it had been there. It was a feeling of nothingness, aloneness, and despair. My feet were stuck in place. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. Still holding the box of playbills, I heard the click of the door as it suddenly opened just a crack. It looked as though it had been lightly pushed open by a breeze, and the light from the hallway streamed in. I was able to move then and quickly stepped through the darkness into the light. That awful alone feeling lifted as I ran down half the flight of stairs and suddenly felt compelled to look back towards the 4th floor landing. Peering over the banister were 3 girls wearing our school uniform, their young faces expressionless and pale. As I watched, they turned and faded from view. I made sure I wasn't alone in that building again. I've always been able to see the dead. Ever since I was a little kid, I could see spirits, usually only in actively haunted places, but occasionally attached to people. They rarely scared me, as most spirits weren't even aware that I could see them. It's when they know you can see them that they get clingy. But my newest batch of second graders has an unwelcome guest. One of my kids, Aaron, has an attachment. As he walked through my classroom's door for the first time, I felt it before I saw it. It felt like hate, and locked eyes with me as it slithered into the classroom behind Aaron. When I realized what it was, I threw my gaze long, hoping it hadn't noticed that I could see it. I don't know how long I'll be able to fool it. I focused hard on Aaron and watched it grow behind him out of the corner of my eye. It clung to the wall behind him. Throughout the day, it faded and grew and occasionally churned enough energy to push Aaron's book off his desk or slam the classroom door, which was near his desk. I had to explain these things away to the kids, feeling horrible about lying to them. As the days wore on, ignoring it became harder. As it hovered near Aaron, the kids sitting near him would suddenly burst into tears, and I'd have to go and do damage control. But Aaron was quiet and calm, seemingly unfazed by it and its reaction to the nearby kids. I don't know if he could see it or feel it, but I knew I'd have to bide my time to help him. Back to school night was just around the corner, and I asked Aaron if his parents would be coming. When he said his mom would be meeting with me, I was eager to have her alone to discuss what was happening. But honestly, I wasn't sure how to broach the conversation. I just knew I had to try for Aaron. As Aaron's mom entered the classroom that night at her appointment time, she looked tired and distracted. We talked about the usual school-related things, and I knew I was running out of time. I asked her if she had noticed anything strange about Aaron lately, and she looked at me directly for the first time. He hasn't been the same since his father died last year. None of us have been, but in some ways it's been easier. He was a horrible, violent man and finally got what he deserved. I just wish poor Aaron hadn't found him. I came home to my poor boy standing at the top of the stairs, just staring at his dad, crumpled at the bottom of the stairs. He must have fallen. That must have been so hard for Aaron, but he never talks about it. I thought about Aaron and his mother as I gathered my bags and shut off my classroom light for the night. Looking down the hallway, I saw him. The dark shape was huddled at the foot of the stairs, seething. He locked eyes with me before I could look away. Now you know. I'm a maintenance man at an old hospital. The hospital grounds and buildings are huge and very old. They date back to the mid-1800s, and it's been some sort of institution since it was first built. It had been a prison first, then a hospital for troubled youths, and now it was a regular hospital. I've seen so many strange things in those buildings, things I can't explain, but have convinced me that there's more around us than what we can actually see. Here are a few of my stories, but I really do have tons of them. Story 1. When I was first hired, there were 4 of us in the maintenance department. Because the building was so old, something always needed to be repaired. I was called in to fix a light in one of the surgical rooms that would turn off during surgeries. I had to wait for late afternoon to do this repair because there were surgeries scheduled that morning. When everybody had cleared out, I cut the power to the room and used my headlamp for light inside the room. As it was an operating room, there was no daylight available for me to see by. I got to work in the empty operating room and immediately felt uncomfortable. I felt as though somebody was watching me. Surgical lights are big and heavy and actually quite involved. I had to concentrate to be sure I was handling it properly. I shook my head and started disassembling the light. As I disassembled piece by piece, I saw the door to the operating suite open slowly. I turned my headlamp in the direction of the door, but there was nobody there. I stopped working for a second, wondering why the door had opened, and in that instant felt a shock go through my fingers. The wire I was holding went live. I don't know how that happened because I had cut the power, but I immediately put everything down and went back out to the electrical box and cut the power again. When I reached the box, the switch was turned to off. So I can't explain how there was an electrical current running through that light. I just know I got shocked. I finished that repair and got out of that operating room as quickly as possible. The whole time I had been doing the work, I had felt like somebody was in that dark room with me. I found out later that that floor was formerly the execution floor. Executions which were done by electric chair. Story 2. We handled all the simple things, but if there were big repairs needed, we'd hire out. In one of the hospital's administrative bathrooms, we found a sizable leak. The leak was happening in the walls and involved the pipes leading to the sinks. Basically, we would need to hire both plumbers and a contractor to repair the walls once the plumbers were done. When we started, there were 2 plumbers. The day they were there, one of them had to run to the store to pick up some supplies, leaving the other one to work alone. The one that stayed found my office and specifically asked me if weird things happened there. Having experienced quite a few weird things, I asked him what happened. He said that 2 of his wrenches went sliding across the floor and he heard singing when his partner had left. He said the bathroom felt very cold despite the old radiator being on, and it just felt weird in there. I told him lots of weird things happen, and the crew and I have just come to expect these things to happen. It's an old building, man. Are you okay to finish the job? Oh, yeah, we'll finish it. The look on his face wasn't convincing, though. The following day, he didn't show up. It was just his buddy who finished the job, and he finished it fast. He didn't say a word about anything happening, but he looked pretty frazzled on his way out. Story 3. Every hospital has a morgue, the place where those that have passed are kept until their families or the state come to handle arrangements. This hospital had its own morgue floor. Being as old as it was, there were many souls that had passed through that building. Also, being in a cold climate, families of those that passed in the wintertime had to wait until the ground thawed to bury their loved ones. This was by far the most active area of the hospital. Things broke so regularly that they moved all administrative offices 1 floor up to avoid disruptions. This left the morgue and the laundry. Besides those 2 sections, the basement was empty. The entire floor was always cold, despite being underground where the temperature was most stable. Lights would burn out very fast, the elevator would get stuck down there. The staff generally refused to take the elevator down there unless they had a gurney to transport. You would also hear voices, and sometimes even crying. It was horrible being down there. I don't know what I was expecting when the guys told me about this floor. Maybe I was just in disbelief, but the first time I was called to work down there, it was to fix the elevator that was stuck. Of course. When we got the call, one of the other maintenance guys, I'll call him Eric, offered to come help me. It can get pretty creepy down there, he said. No, I'll be okay, I told him. Honestly, it kinda creeped me out that the guys wouldn't work down there alone. Most people don't like to admit when they're scared, especially at work. I took the stairs down to the morgue floor, and the moment I walked through that doorway into the hallway, everything felt different. First, it was colder, which didn't make sense. The morgue is closed and locked for obvious reasons, so it shouldn't have been colder down there. Second, the walls are a sickly pale green color. Ugly? Yes. Creepy? Also yes. I didn't know why this floor wasn't painted white like the rest of the hospital. It just didn't feel comfortable down here. And lastly, the floor was always so quiet. Like I said, there weren't any administrative offices down there anymore, just the morgue, which by default is quiet, and the laundry at the far end of the floor through the doorway, so you really couldn't hear much from in there. Hospitals generally have a quiet hum of white noise, but this floor was silent. As I set my tools down by the elevator door, I hit the button just to see if the doors would open. To my surprise, the down arrow came on, and I could hear the elevator moving closer. Oh, I guess it got stuck between floors, I thought. The door opened, and a thin man in a hospital gown stood inside, looking at me. I was surprised, but instinctively stepped back to let him off the elevator. As I turned to let him know he was probably on the wrong floor, I realized he was gone. There was absolutely no sign of him. The floor was quiet, the elevator was empty, and so was the hallway. He was just gone. There was nowhere for him to go. As I said, the morgue is locked. The laundry is all the way down the hallway through the doors. There was nowhere for him to go. I grabbed my tools and ran back up those stairs. I told Eric what had happened. He laughed and said, "I told you, man, creepy stuff happens." He told me about the first and last time he went down there alone. He said he was fixing the doorknob on the laundry room, and the morgue door suddenly started slamming open and shut over and over. He said he had to run past it to get up the stairs. He said he's never gone down there by himself again. Since that experience, I never go down to the morgue floor alone. If there are repairs that need to be done, when there aren't two of us available, they just have to wait. As it is, weird things still happen when we're doing repairs together on that floor, but it's more bearable when you're not alone. There was one morning when we had to replace all the fluorescent lights in the hallway of the morgue floor, and we were down there for like 3 hours. Even though the whole place felt heavy and uncomfortable, nothing happened. As we were packing our stuff to go back upstairs, we heard something move in the morgue room. I looked at Eric and started towards the sound. "Don't do it, man. Let's just go. Don't even look." He genuinely looked worried. I turned back and picked up my bag, but we did have to walk past the door to the morgue to get to the stairs. Eric walked fast past the door, looking down at the ground. But I couldn't help myself. I wish I hadn't looked, because I'll never forget what I saw. Through the window, standing just on the other side of the door, was an old woman staring through the door at me. As I looked at her face, I knew I was looking at someone that was no longer alive. I couldn't look away. As I passed the door, her mouth opened into a silent scream as she stared at me. I heard nothing but our footsteps now running towards the stairs. I have so many more stories to tell about this hospital, but that's it for now. If you do want to hear more, let me know. I just bought my first house in a town close to where my parents live. It's a small house. Really all I could afford, but it's mine, and I'm super happy about it. I worked a lot, but my job wasn't the best paying, so I'd also hustle as a house cleaner on the side to help with bills. I've cleaned houses for years in the town where my parents live because it's small and everyone kind of knows each other. My parents are getting older and their friends are also older. Older folks sometimes don't have the energy or ability to keep their houses clean, so they call me. Mostly just tidying up. It's not a bad gig, usually just a few hours of dusting, grabbing the mail, doing laundry, that sort of thing. One day, I got an email from an out-of-state law firm that requested my services. They were preparing to sell a house that had been empty and needed it cleaned for selling purposes. Along with cleaning, I was to box and organize belongings in the house. No problem. Except that the house they were contacting me about was super creepy. About 10 years ago, the former owners of that house were in a car accident. The car had gone off the road and into the river that divided my new town with my parents' town. All 3 members of the family had passed away in that accident. I'll call them the Smith family. It was a couple and their teenage son. He had been driving at the time of the accident. There had been rumors about the family that the mother had wanted a divorce or something, but rumors are rumors. The house stood empty for about 2 years until the legal proceedings were done, and the owner, a sister of the deceased man, took possession of the property. She now wanted to sell the house, contents included. The thing is, for those 2 years, the house was left exactly as it had been left that day that the family died. Nothing had changed. There was a bike in the driveway that hadn't moved. The front yard was overgrown except the grass. I guess a neighbor mowed it occasionally. You could still see the curtains in the windows, and in the daytime you could see the light from the back windows letting the daylight through. Literally nothing had changed since that horrible day. My parents didn't know them, but their neighbors said they were generally nice people. As the boy had gotten older, he started getting into trouble, and that's when the rumors of the divorce were spreading. The whole community was shocked when the accident happened, though, and being a small town, it was talked about for months. Eventually, the talk changed from, "What a sad situation," to, "The police were called again." Apparently, neighbors reported seeing movement in the house on occasion, and one day the garage door was even open in the early morning hours. Each time the police were called, they'd search the house and find nothing. No signs of a break-in, nothing disturbed. The house came to be known as the Haunted Smith House. The law firm knew none of this, and I imagine the new owner didn't either. It was just local knowledge. Regardless, they needed it cleaned out and must have gotten my name as the local cleaning service. Man, I didn't want to do this job. At the time, I wasn't sure I believed in paranormal stuff, so it wasn't so much about the house's history, but more about the long hours I knew this job would take. But the firm's offer was generous, and my new house had a mortgage payment. I said yes, and the firm turned on the utilities and sent a locksmith to change the locks on the house. The locksmith would be there on a Friday, and I would have the keys that afternoon. I was ready to start cleaning on Saturday. Friday came, and the locksmith changed the front and back locks and dropped the keys off with the local sheriff. I picked them up that evening and also bought a ton of boxes from the hardware store for packing up the house. I drove by the house on my way back home and saw a light on inside the front hallway. I guess the locksmith must have left it on, I thought. I drove home thinking about that light. It bothered me, but of course the locksmith must have just forgotten to turn it off, right? I pushed it out of my head. I went for a walk, started laundry, and had dinner. Pretty soon I forgot about the house until I was getting ready for bed and went to set my phone alarm for the next morning. I had a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. There was a voicemail. I listened to the voicemail, and it sounded like a butt dial for a second. First it was quiet, then I heard what sounded like water running. I listened carefully for another second, then heard a crash before the phone disconnected. What the hell? That was weird. Must have been a wrong number. I put my phone down and got ready for bed. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The next morning, I got my supplies together with the boxes and drove to the Smith house. I pulled up to the house and unloaded my cleaning supplies. I put the crisp key in the lock and turned it, pushing the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. The house had a musty, baked smell, like too many summers with no open windows. Every surface had a light dust, and there were footsteps and smudges in the dust all around the door. From the locksmith, I thought. Thinking again about the locksmith, I looked straight at the lamp in the entryway. The lamp was off. I know I had seen that light on when I drove by last night, and now it was turned off. Maybe the bulb burned out? I took a step towards the lamp and turned the switch. It came on. I stopped to think. I know I had seen that light on last night. I shook my head. I don't have time for this, I thought. I set my supplies down, turned around, and closed the front door. The house was silent. I took a deep breath and started looking around. It wasn't a big house, but it had plenty of belongings. There were family pictures on the wall, a little boy's school picture, a wedding portrait, a lifetime of memories from people whose lives ended horribly and suddenly. As I leaned in to look at the pictures on the wall, I heard a crash. Something hit the floor in the other room. I stopped, sucked in my breath, and turned to face the sound. Hello? Someone there? Silence. I walked towards the source of the sound. As I took a few steps towards the back of the house, I saw a shadow move across the light streaming into the hallway from the kitchen. I froze. Who's in the kitchen? Nobody had answered me, and there wasn't supposed to be anyone there. I turned around and left the house. I went to my car and called the police. They arrived about 10 minutes later and did a walkthrough of the house. Nothing. They found nothing out of the ordinary. Just my supplies in the front area, but no doors or windows looked disturbed. They said there had been some break-ins in the area, but if there had been an intruder in the house, they were gone now. As a precaution, they told me to turn the lights on when I left, and that way, when they patrolled, they could see the house better. After they left, I called my parents just to have a familiar voice on the phone. When I picked up my phone to call, I saw I had a voicemail. It was the same number as before, and when I hit play, I heard the same sounds as before, what sounded like running water, and then the click of the call ending. Ugh, I don't have time for prank calls, I thought to myself. I dialed my mom's number and was happy when she picked up. I told her what had happened in the house, and she said she'd come over and help me. I was relieved she wasn't busy and told her it would be great for her to come by. I hung up the phone and picked up my supplies. I walked towards the back of the house, past the kitchen on the left, and entered the living room. The living room was a large room and had a big sliding glass door leading out to the backyard. It was a beautiful day, so I reached for the curtains to pull them open. As I did, I heard with complete clarity the words, "Don't go," whispered directly into my right ear. I turned very slowly towards the right. As my head turned all the way around, I saw a shadow move out of sight in the hallway behind me. I stood silently waiting for some sound or some movement, but it never came. I was absolutely frozen in place. I wanted to run back towards the door, but that would mean going in the direction of that shadow. I stood quietly and waited a few more seconds and then walked to the far end of the living room where I could get a better view down the hallway. If there was somebody in the house, they would have gone into the kitchen or down into the basement. There was no second story in this house. My first thought was maybe the police had come back. But when I looked down the hallway towards the front door, there was nobody there. The house was quiet. I took the few steps past the kitchen towards the front door, opened it, and was relieved to be outside in the sunshine. I waited in my car until my mom arrived. Either I was losing my mind or there was something in that house that I couldn't see. My mom pulled up about half an hour later and we walked inside together. Now, my mom is a person that believes paranormal stuff may exist, ghosts, demons, that sort of thing, but she's pretty tough and certainly wasn't going to let anything mess with her daughter. As soon as she got there, she helped me bring in more cleaning supplies and started walking through the house. Somehow, when you're not alone in a creepy place, it just doesn't seem quite as creepy. I felt bolder just having her there, and I moved towards the kitchen to start the boxing up process. I had packed up a few boxes when I heard my mom call. I walked towards the back of the house, through the living room, and into what must have been the teenage boy's room. The TV was on, and she was standing there staring at it. She hadn't heard me enter the room, and I asked, "Why are you watching TV?" She said she wasn't. She said when she'd come into the room, it was already on. She thought I had turned it on earlier. I told her I hadn't, that I hadn't even gotten to this room yet. We stood staring at the TV in silence. She turned it off and swung open the closet door, but, of course, there was nobody there. "I don't know, maybe I bumped into it when I walked in," she said. We left the room together, and she closed the door behind us. "Let's just get to work," she said. We spent the next few hours boxing up the kitchen. As soon as everything was packed and moved out into the hallway against the wall, we planned on cleaning the kitchen and then moving on to the next room. But first, lunch. We had been working pretty quietly throughout the morning, both of us thinking about what we'd seen and what had happened that morning. I was also quiet because I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be alert in case I heard something. Silly, maybe, but I was definitely on edge. At lunch, she told me she had been really uncomfortable all morning and didn't like being in that house. I agreed and told her I was considering calling the law office and telling them I'd changed my mind about the job. My mom shook her head. "You need the money, darling. We'll work on it together." As we drove back to the house after lunch, my phone rang again. Since I was driving, my mom answered. "Hello?" She listened for a second, and then held the phone out, looking at the number. "There's nobody there," she said. Sounded like water flowing, and then it hung up. "I've gotten that call now like 3 times from the same number. It's really weird. I should just block the number and be done with it," I told her. She looked at the phone, hit block, and handed it back to me. "There, it's done. Now you'll never hear from them again," she said, smiling. When we got back to the house, everything was quiet. We walked back towards the kitchen to start cleaning and saw one of the boxes that we'd packed was sitting on the floor, open. Nothing in it had been disturbed, but it was just sitting in the middle of the floor, open. I looked at my mom and said, "You didn't put that there, did you?" She shook her head slowly. We picked up the box, retaped it, and set it back in the hallway. We did a quick scan of the house just to make sure nobody was there. The scary truth was we knew we wouldn't find anybody there. We kept working until the sun went down, and the feeling in the house got heavier and heavier. Both my mom and I were getting more and more uncomfortable, like tense. I don't know if it was the house or the workload or the stress, but all we wanted to do was leave. With the living room packed and the kitchen cleaned, we called it a night. I turned the lights on in the house before we left, as the police had told me to do. She went home, and I drove to my house. I was so ready for a good night's sleep. We had agreed to meet the next morning early at the Smith house. I pulled into my driveway and looked at my new house. The front light was on like I always left it, and it looked so cozy and inviting. With keys in hand, I grabbed my bag and headed towards the door. I looked down at my keys to unlock the front door and realized that I have attached my car keys to the Smith house key, and not my house key. Oh no, I thought. With a sinking feeling, I reached into my bag and couldn't feel my house keys. I dumped out my whole bag. No keys. I realized I had to drive back to the Smith house because there was nowhere else I would have left my keys. I had them when I left this morning because my door is locked. With all the day's drama, I must have just hooked the wrong set onto my car keys. I thought about calling my mom to ask her to meet me at the Smith house, but it was getting late and I couldn't ask her to come back out just to babysit me for a few seconds. I took a deep breath, got back into my car, and started back towards the Smith house. Just as I was getting out of my neighborhood, I heard my phone. I picked it up to see the same number that I thought my mom had blocked. I answered it, and again, all I heard was the sound of running water. I knew the call was about to hang up, but before it did, I heard laughter, and then it hung up. Why does this keep happening? I thought to myself. Some stupid kid has my number and keeps pranking me. I'm gonna have to block their number when I get a chance. At the traffic light, I studied the number more closely, and for some reason, it was vaguely familiar. But I couldn't think about that then. I was too preoccupied with getting myself ready to go back into that house. I'll just run in and run out, I thought to myself. I pulled up to the house, and the first thing I noticed was that the house was dark. I was absolutely sure that I had turned on the lights before we left, and now they're off. As far as I knew, I was the only one with the key. I killed the engine and sat staring at that house. There was no movement, it was just dead. I couldn't stall any longer. I had to just go in and get my keys. As I walked towards the house, I could feel my heart beating faster. My palms were sweating and my eyes were scanning all around looking for movement. But there was none, just the quiet, dark house. I put the key in the lock and it turned. I opened the door and reached for the light switch. I turned the hallway light on and quickly looked at the boxes lining the wall. All the lights in the house were off, aside from the one I had just turned on. Just find your keys, I thought to myself. I moved down the hallway towards the kitchen. I rounded the corner into the kitchen and turned the light on. Scanning the room, I saw my wallet by the sink. Oh wow, I didn't even realize I'd left that here. I walked over towards the counter and reached for my wallet. And as I did, I looked in the sink. The bottom of the sink, there was about an inch of standing water. That was definitely not there when we left, I thought to myself. At that moment, the handheld part of the old house phone on the wall dropped to the floor. I jumped and turned. The receiver was now on the floor with its long cord attached. It rocked a little as I stared at it. Everything inside my head told me to run out of that house, but I still had to find my keys. I gripped my wallet and took quick steps towards the kitchen door. I had to pass the phone. For some reason, I reached down to pick it back up. As I replaced it back on the wall, I looked at the number written on the phone. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the number on the phone was the same one that had been calling me. Oh my God, I thought to myself, what is going on here? Just as the words went through my mind, the sink turned on. I turned in horror, staring at the water running. I was stunned, and then for some reason felt like I had to turn it off. Maybe I just wanted things to stop, or some pre-programmed voice that nagged me not to leave it on. I took the few steps towards the sink and turned the water off. I got out of that kitchen. I walked quickly into the living room, but didn't see my keys. The room was still dark, but I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I thought of calling my mom. Maybe she had the keys, and if she did, I could get the hell out of this house. Of course, this didn't make sense. All I had to do was go through the bedrooms to check and see if my keys were there. But I was in such a panic at this point, I wasn't thinking clearly. I reached into my pocket and realized I'd left my phone outside. My heart sank. Now I felt totally alone. I had to go look in the bedrooms. I started with the couple's bedroom. There was no overhead light, so I had to find the lamp by the bedroom door. The seconds it took to walk from that bedroom door through the darkness of that room to the lamp seemed to last forever. I scanned the room. No keys. I tried taking a deep breath, knowing I'd have to go into the boys' room, but I couldn't get enough air. I left the light on in this room and went into the hallway. His bedroom door was closed, just as we'd left it. As I crossed the hallway, I heard the TV in the room turn on. Oh, I don't want to go in there, but this is the last place where the keys could be. The door gave way as I turned the doorknob. There, on the floor in front of the TV, were my house keys. I scanned the room. I couldn't see much beyond the TV's blue light. I stepped into the room and reached for my keys. Got 'em. As I turned to leave, I heard a whisper in my ear, the same voice I had heard before. I want to drive your car too. Every inch of my skin was crawling when I heard that whisper. Whatever this was, it was evil. I bolted. I ran down the hallway past the kitchen. I could hear the water running again. I ran past the boxes and flung open the front door. I left it wide open as I ran straight to my car. I got in, slammed the door, put the keys in the ignition, and floored it out of there. I never wanted to go back in that house again. I decided I would take the loss and call the law firm in the morning. I'll tell them I won't be finishing that job. As I drove, I started to feel a little bit better, knowing I'd never have to go back there. I rolled the window down to get some fresh air. My breath was starting to get back to normal now. I reached for my phone to call my mom. I had to tell her what happened and warn her not to go back to that house in the morning. As I turned my phone over, I accidentally hit the answer button. The phone had been receiving a call. I instinctively put it to my ear and heard, "I told you not to leave." Then I heard the sound of water rushing, but this time it was getting louder and louder. It was the last sound I heard as my car hit the black river water. About a year into becoming a realtor, I was getting pretty comfortable setting up meetings with prospective buyers at houses they were interested in seeing. The way it worked was prospective buyers would contact me looking to buy a new house. After some back and forth to narrow down their search, and after they submitted pre-approval paperwork, we started the house showing process. Either I or they would suggest a house to tour. I would get the access code or key to the house, and we would meet there at an appointed time. In the winters, sometimes appointments were scheduled after the sun had gone down, but ideally I would try to schedule with enough time to show the house when it was still light out. It was best for sales to see houses in full light. They were brighter and happier in the daytime. Buyers could see if there were any flaws, and they could see the property outside too. Snooping around a backyard by flashlight isn't the ideal way of presenting a house to a buyer. But timing didn't always work out, and occasionally I'd have to meet prospective buyers after dark. I had been emailing with a young couple who was buying their first house, and their budget was tight. This meant they were limited to houses that were more on the inexpensive side. This would usually mean older houses or ones that might need some extra work. This was fine by me. A sale was a sale. We made a plan to visit a house that was just on the edge of the historic village part of town at about 4:30 p.m. Since it was November, the sun would already be going down. and I told them I'd be there ahead of time to open up the house and to just enter when they arrived. If you don't know, realtors get a good bit of information about a property before they show it. The pictures I had seen of the listing showed an older house, big barn, big house, pretty typical for an older Massachusetts house. The property had been in the same family for about 30 years until the current owner moved into assisted living. Before that, it had been a funeral parlor. Oh wow. I tried to keep creepy thoughts out of my head, but all I could imagine was where and how the deceased were kept in the house. Well, I wasn't gonna live there, I told myself. I pushed the creepy thoughts out of my head and got in my car. Since it had been empty for a few months, I wanted to be sure it didn't smell musty or, looked clean enough to show. It was 3:30. When I arrived at the house, it looked just as it did in the pictures. It was a big 2-story colonial, painted white with black shutters, and had a barn connected to the house by a covered walkway. Oh yeah, that's probably where business was conducted, I thought to myself. It looked a little more run down now, as the previous owner had taken the listing pictures almost a half year prior. Paint was peeling a little, not too badly, but you could tell nobody lived there. Something that I learned through being a realtor: houses that aren't lived in tend to die quickly. They just look empty and unloved, like this house. I grabbed my bag and paperwork and headed to the front door. The lockbox was hanging on the doorknob, and I used the code to open the box to get the house key. The lock gave way, and I opened the door. Peering inside, I could see the only light in the house was coming from the windows. There were no curtains, so the day's remaining light lit the front area. There was a tall open staircase just to the side of the front door, and a hallway leading towards the back of the house along the main floor. From the front door, there was a room to the right and a room to the left. The floors were old hardwood and showed all the signs of years of wear. I stepped inside and looked for the light switch. The front hallway switch didn't turn anything on, so it was probably meant to be used with a lamp, but of course there was no furniture in the house, so I went towards the room to the right. This would have been the living room. I found another light switch there. The overhead light came on, but didn't go too far because of all the dark hardwood. Realtors with a lot of experience will always remind you to be sure and listen when you enter a house. Houses that are empty can sometimes pick up unwanted guests. People who need to get in from the cold and have nowhere else to go. Remembering their warnings, I set my stuff down and listened. It was silent. The only thing I could hear was the wood floor beneath my feet. I kept my coat on because the house was very cold, so cold I could actually see my breath. I started my check of the house by walking towards the back of the room which led to the kitchen. It was dark with only a small window over the old sink. Not much to see here. I left the kitchen and went back towards the hallway under the stairs. As I entered the hallway, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. I froze. "Hello?" I called out. I figured it was the couple that I was meeting. I walked quickly towards the front of the stairwell and looked up. There was nobody there, and there were no sounds from above. Now, this was an old house with hardwood floors. I would hear somebody moving around if there was somebody there. But the house was silent again. Okay, now I'm just getting spooked. There's nobody there. I would have heard the front door, I thought to myself. I pushed the memory of those steps out of my head and turned to go towards the room to the left of the stairs. This was another sitting area, about the same size as the first room I had entered, but this one had a large stone fireplace. I tried to imagine how that fireplace would have warmed this room and might have actually felt cozy at one point, but not today. The only place left to look in the main house was upstairs. I turned around and started climbing the stairs. With each creaky step, I got more and more creeped out. I couldn't help the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked at my watch. 3:58. I really had to get it together before this couple showed up. I got to the top of the stairs and turned the corner towards the 2 bedrooms at the front of the house. Between me and the bedrooms, there was a small bathroom with a tub, and it was all in desperate need of a remodel. I walked to the front 2 bedrooms and peeked inside. Of course, there was nobody there. The 2 big empty bedrooms faced the street. I tried to imagine that at some point in the history of the house, those bedrooms had had happy memories, maybe of children or a happy couple. I walked to the back bedroom, past the bathroom, and found the bedroom where the older lady must have spent her last few months. There was a large bed frame and old curtains on the window. This room made me feel uncomfortable, and I turned to leave. Just as I did, I heard the bathroom door shut quietly. The bathroom had 2 doors, one leading to the hallway and the other leading into this bedroom. I turned around. It was the bathroom door to the bedroom that had closed. I stood still for a moment. There are 3 emergency responses a body has to fear: fight, flight, or freeze. And I froze. I don't think it's possible to listen any harder than I did at that moment. I remembered the footsteps that I heard on the stairs and immediately started to panic. After a few moments of hearing nothing, I stepped into the hallway, turned left, and headed towards the open bathroom door. I peered around the corner, craning to look into the bathroom. Since the light was off, I reached my hand into the bathroom and slid it along the wall and found the light switch. The bathroom was empty. There was nobody there, but the door leading to the bedroom was closed. I hadn't imagined the sound. I turned and headed back to the stairs. I told myself, weird things happen in old houses. They shift. They're drafty. I didn't want to give it much thought. As I turned the corner at the top of the stairs, I looked down and froze. At the bottom of the stairs was a tall man wearing a long coat and what looked like a top hat. He looked up the stairs, looked straight at me, and then turned. He walked towards the back of the house behind the stairs. I took 2 steps down the stairs, watching him go, and then he disappeared. I don't mean he went out of sight. I mean he literally disappeared as I was watching him walk away. I realized there had been no footsteps, just movement, just the shape of that man, but no footsteps. It was only my footsteps on the stairs I could hear now. I could hardly process what I had seen. Who was that? What was that? I stood on those stairs for what had to have been a solid minute, leaning back against the wall to keep myself from falling. I had never seen anything like that before. I made it down the stairs and quickly stepped out through the front door. Cold November air hit my face, and it was then that I realized I was shaking, not from the cold, but from what I had just seen. I stood in front of that house for probably 5 minutes, just trying to figure out what to do next. I did not want to go back into that house, but I knew the buyers would be here soon, and it was getting dark. I decided to get my big flashlight out of the car and took a deep breath. I headed back into the house. The last part of the house I had to check was the last one I wanted to go to. It was where that man had gone. I turned on the hallway lights and walked to the back of the house. I turned on the back porch light and the light in the hallway leading to the barn. I doubled up on the light with my big flashlight and took the last few steps to the barn door. I pulled the big wooden door open and shined my flashlight into the barn. I tried reaching around the edge of the wall to find a light switch, but I couldn't find one. I scanned the barn with my big flashlight and saw a big table on one end with a sink over the wide drain. There was a large metal table in the middle of the room. This must have been where the funeral home operated. It was every bit as creepy as you can imagine. With that, I turned around and closed the barn door. I took some quick steps back through the hallway and quickly entered the main house just under the stairwell, and as I rounded the stairwell into the hallway, I ran straight into something solid. I let out a little scream, and so did the wall I ran into. It wasn't a wall, it was the husband of the couple arriving for their appointment. I tried to keep myself together, but I'm sure I looked like a frazzled mess. We laughed for a second, and I welcomed them to the house. I told them I was just looking around before they had arrived. They said they saw my car and figured we were already inside. To take advantage of the remaining daylight, they had taken a peek in the backyard before coming in. We? I asked. Yeah, tall guy in a long jacket. We saw him going into the barn, but he didn't hear us calling to him. Isn't he with you? That was it. I couldn't let these people buy this house without telling them what I'd seen. I brought them outside and we sat in my car. I told them everything. The steps, the bathroom door, that I'd seen the same man. I told them everything. Their response? That's awesome. We're going to live in a real haunted house. I honestly have no idea if they believe me, but they did say they saw the guy. So my conscience is clear. Their financing went through and they moved in. They still live there to this day. Sometimes I wonder if they still see the man in the top hat, and if they see more spirits than the one that looked at me that day. In New Orleans in the late 1700s, there was a beautiful young woman of color named Julie who fell madly in love with a wealthy white landowner. He spent a great deal of time conducting business in the city, and during these trips, he romanced Julie, taking her to all the most fashionable balls and parties in town. Her beauty was the talk of the town, and he liked the feeling of envious eyes watching when he had his beautiful lover at his side during these visits to the city. He put her up in a beautiful 3-story building, 734 Royal Street, right in the French Quarter. As his lover, she lived a lavish lifestyle. He gave her beautiful dresses, jewelry, and other fine things. The best food and drink, anything a young New Orleans socialite would want. Everything except one thing. He would not marry her because she was not white. Not only was it illegal at the time, but he knew his family would expect him to marry another white landowner's daughter. He didn't want to upset and lose her, so he would tease her by saying, "Sure, we'll get married if you do this or if you do that. If you wear your hair a certain way, or kiss me behind the ear." Tons of little requests just to distract her away from marriage. Julie was madly in love with the young man and would comply with all that he had asked of her. And then he'd make a new demand of her. This went on for months, and she became increasingly more insistent that he find a way to marry her. He hoped she would eventually stop pushing for marriage and just be content to be his lover when he'd visit New Orleans. On one such trip into the city, he was exhausted from the long, cold ride. It was a very cold night in December. If you've never been to New Orleans, I must tell you it's very humid, which means whether it's cold or hot, there's a ton of moisture in the air. This makes New Orleans summers oppressive, and the coldest winter nights miserably damp and frigid. This was one such night. The landowner arrived at Julie's home in the French Quarter and took off his heavy coat. She was happy to see him and brought him to the fireplace, where there was a toasty fire warming the room. She sat on his lap and they laughed and kissed. He was telling her about the ride into town and how miserable it had been. She said, "You wouldn't have to travel if we were married and if you lived here with me." This frustrated him, and he pushed her off his lap. He was tired of her pleading with him to get married. He was sick of having to explain that he couldn't marry her. He was annoyed by her loneliness and her pleas about marriage, and finally said, "If you want to marry me so badly, then prove it. Take off your clothes and go up on the roof and stay up there until the sun rises, and then I'll marry you." She burst into tears and ran to the bedroom. He, being equally frustrated with his own temper, had just ruined the short time they'd spent together, put his coat back on, and charged back out into the night. He quickly found a local gentleman's club, bright and inviting, and lost himself in drinking and cards. It was early in the night, about 7, but it was already so cold. The Mississippi's thick mist was rolling in. It hovered in the air and coated the cobblestone streets. Meanwhile, Julie was devastated. She laid in her bed and cried until she didn't have any tears left. His words stung, and she thought about what he'd said. "I'll show him. I'll do it. I will go up on that roof, and then he'll have to marry me." She took off her beautiful dress, her fancy shoes, and even her jewelry. She took the steep metal stairs to the roof of the house. There was a small, narrow walkway close to the chimney. Just 3 stories below her was a raging fire, warm and cozy. All she felt of it now was the slight warmth of the chimney bricks as she crouched down and leaned against them. She curled up into a little ball against the warmth of the chimney and winced as the cold air hit her exposed skin. She was afraid of moving too much for fear that she might slip and fall to her death. She closed her eyes, wondering how long it would be until the sun came up. While at the club, the landowner ran into his friends, and they lost themselves in card games and rum. Pretty soon, he forgot about his argument with Julie and what he'd said to her. He spent hours playing cards, drinking, laughing, smoking, doing all the things he loved doing in the big city. Just after 4 a.m., one of his friends asked about Julie. She was usually with him on party nights like this. "Oh, we got into an argument and she's cross with me," he said. Seeing that morning was approaching and feeling the rum, he said his goodbyes and stumbled back to the house on Royal Street. He opened the door and took off his coat. The first thing he noticed was that the house was quiet. She must be sleeping, he thought. Then he saw that there was no fire going, and the fireplace was cold. It had been out for some time. The house was cold and dark. He went up the stairs to their bedroom and opened the door. The bed was made, but it hadn't been slept in. He stood silently in that bedroom. Such a stark contrast from the noise and partying he had just been a part of. Then it hit him, the last words he'd said to her. With a sickening feeling, he stumbled through the house, slamming open each door, but every room was empty. With panic setting in, he knew there was one last place to look. He climbed the steep metal stairs, opened the hatch to the roof walkway, and looked around the roof in the growing daylight. Leaning against the now cold chimney was Julie's lifeless, naked body. He ran across the roof, sliding on the slick tiles, and collapsed in front of her. Her skin was like ice. Her arms were stiff, folded around her knees like a beautiful, crumpled doll. She had done exactly as he had asked for the final time, but now would never marry anyone. To this day, on cold December nights, people report seeing the ghost of a beautiful young lady walking on the rooftop of that same building. Sometimes she is naked, and sometimes she is seen wearing a wedding dress. When 734 Royal Street was the home of Bottom of the Teacup psychic readings, the owners reported that Julie roamed the inside of the building too, but that her presence was always friendly. Customers also reported hearing laughter and singing and felt the energy of the young woman named Julie. It's also been reported that a sad man's spirit is seen walking in the garden of that building, and it's believed to be the young landowner. My family owned some land near Roxbury, Vermont, that we'd visit in the summers. It was a big plot, about 60 acres, and mostly wooded. There was a small cabin, just comfortable enough to spend a few weeks in the summers, and then head back to Connecticut where we were living. I remember how fun it was to be a kid exploring the woods with my older brother, Chris. Our parents always warned us to stay clear of the northern edge of the property, though. They said there were caves out there, and we might run into a bear if we got too close. I remember the day my mom warned us off that side of the land. She got really serious and looked at my dad, who looked at her and then away. It was weird. I had no idea why. I was just a kid. I guess they thought the bear warning was enough to scare us off, and they dropped it after that. Of course, it had the opposite effect. What 12 and 14-year-olds don't want to see a bear? Seeing wild animals was the highlight of summer cabin trips for us, so we'd sneak off towards the northern end of the property for these caves, but never found one. One year, on a summer morning, we headed out for a family hike. As we headed towards the tree line, we found a trail of dead grass. It looked singed or burned, dark and brittle, as though someone had burned a path from the north side tree line to the center of the small clearing next to the cabin. It was about 3 feet wide and stood in sharp contrast with the lush green summer grass just beyond its edges. We silently looked down at this dead patch of earth and also noticed the woods were silent too. There were no birds or bugs making any noises. My brother and I were the first to break the spell, stepping towards the weird burned grass. "No!" my mom said loudly, breaking the silence. My parents looked at each other and rushed us inside. They told us not to go outside, and we'd hike tomorrow instead. We were bummed, but honestly more freaked out by the way our parents were acting. They weren't people that were scared of natural things, but whatever this was didn't seem natural. We stayed inside that day and watched movies instead. It had been a beautiful day, but my mom closed all the curtains and told us to stay inside. I remember talking to Chris later that day, and he brushed me off, saying our parents were just being careful and not to worry. But I couldn't help noticing his voice was a little shaky too. After that day, he didn't want to go searching for bears anymore. My parents took us to Vermont less after that summer, and when we would go, they'd keep us close to the cabin. "No wandering off," they'd say. Fast forward to now. My brother and I are adults, and our parents have passed away. My dad passed 3 years ago, and my mom 2 months ago. When we settled the accounts, we found that she'd left us the Vermont cabin to share, but had also added an odd note. Avoid the north end of the property. We hadn't been to that cabin in years. As my parents had gotten older, they couldn't really hike anymore, and Chris had family and kids that kept him busy. I was tied up with work and figured the cabin was probably in rough shape after years of neglect and so many harsh winters. Chris and I planned to go up together before winter, but time was running out and he couldn't get away. I decided to go up on my own and check and winterize the old cabin before it snowed. Hopefully, it wasn't too bad. I planned on being there for a long weekend and brought a tent to stay in just in case the cabin was unlivable. I took the 3-hour drive north on Route 91, and it was just getting dark when I got there. Of course, the cabin was dark and quiet, and as I approached from my car, all I could hear was the sounds of the crunching leaves under my feet. That was odd. Usually you'd hear crickets this time of year. I brushed the thought off as I headed towards the door. I opened the cabin door and clicked on the lights. So many memories came rushing into my mind. The summers we spent there, the good times we had. And then I remembered that weird day we found the burnt path near the cabin. I was happy to brush that thought away, though, too. As I scanned the cabin, I could see mouse poop and some spider webs, which is pretty normal for empty spaces, especially in cold climates. But the cabin was dry, the roof was still holding, and it was otherwise clean. I brought in my bag, my laptop, and some food supplies for the weekend. I also brought a game cam so I could see what was living around the cabin. Bears are more active in the fall just before hibernation, so I was hoping to catch a glimpse of one while I was out there. I set up the camera facing the north tree line before it got too dark, started a fire in the small wood stove, and swept out the mouse poop. I'd made myself a cold cut sandwich and set up my sleeping bag on the old couch. I watched the fire die as I fell asleep. I woke up late the next morning and made some coffee. I cleaned more of the cabin and eventually sat down for a late lunch. I looked at my phone. 3:25 p.m. I made myself another cup of coffee and opened the front door to get some fresh air in the cabin. I flipped on my laptop and tapped into the game cam feed to see if any motion had triggered it last night. There were 2 notifications of activity. I clicked on the first notification. 11:20 p.m. I watched in horror as I saw a figure in a black cape glide from the tree line to the clearing next to the cabin. The figure was tall and skinny, and the cape was long and shredded, dragging on the floor behind it. It stopped directly in front of the camera about 10 feet away and didn't move. Even though the footage was black and white, the darkness of that figure seemed to suck out all the light in the video. It was like a black hole in the middle of the screen. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. All I could see in the hood was darkness. It was terrifying. I watched this figure continue to stand dead still until the game cam timed out due to inactivity. It never moved. With a shaking hand, I clicked on the second activity notification. 6:20 a.m. As I watched, my heart went cold. The figure turned and glided back into the dense wood line. I quickly clicked on the dead space between the 2 notifications and sped up the footage. From 11:20 p.m. to 6:20 a.m., this figure stood stock still, facing the cabin, for 7 hours. The only movement in that dead space was the grotesque twitching of the trees in the sped-up footage and the shadows moving as the night's darkness faded. That thing was standing just feet away from me for hours while I slept. I sat frozen, staring at that laptop, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I had shivers running up and down my arms, and I felt myself starting to panic. I closed the laptop. As I looked up at the open cabin door, I realized it was silent. No birds, no sounds. I wanted to run over and slam it shut, but I knew I had to go look. I stepped out the door and made my way towards the space in the clearing where the figure had been standing. My stomach lurched. There was a burn mark in the dead leaves. From the tree line to the place where the figure had stood, the leaves were black, the ground beneath charred. The memory of that summer we saw the charred path came screaming back into my head as I ran inside. What the hell was that thing? What did it want? Did my parents know about it? I grabbed my stuff and got the hell out of there. I grabbed my phone and saw a text from Chris. Hey, I'm headed up to the cabin. I should be there by 11 tonight. See you then. I tried calling my brother, but it went straight to voicemail. I kept calling, but still, only voicemail. My phone was almost dead. Now I had to drive back up this dark, wooded road to the cabin and wait. I'm an overnight guard of an old historic estate. It's a sprawling place rooted deep in history. This estate stands tall on the National Historic Registry, a testament to one of our state's oldest and most enduring landmarks. With its grand, imposing house, sturdy barns and stables, and even its old wooden beehives, the estate and its history are well known. It's a place alive during the day, welcoming curious tourists and the excitement of school field trips. But when the sun goes down, a different kind of life stirs here. The current owners are stubborn. They'll never admit this place is haunted. I imagine they're afraid it'll scare people off. But I've seen things that would make your hair turn white. I've got a ton of stories from this place, each one more terrifying than the last. I'll share 2 of them now. The first happened a couple of years ago in late September. There's about 50 acres I'm responsible for patrolling, which in the fall includes a tall corn maze set up for the season. We've had people sneak into the maze after closing and leave beer bottles and trash, so I'm supposed to walk the maze during my overnights. Fall is beautiful here during the day, but at night, this place is seriously creepy. The owners have this thing about turning off the lights at the front of the house, but I've always been one to bend the rules a bit, so I keep a small lamp burning in the front room to see better when I make my rounds. I also keep the lights on in the administrative office at the back of the house. Besides those 2 lights, the house is pitch black. Right outside that office, there's the back door leading to a wide porch that faces out toward the farm buildings and the sprawling corn maze. And let me tell you, when that moonlight starts playing tricks on your eyes out there, you'd swear this place was straight out of one of those horror movies. Every single night I hear those damn hardwood floors creaking and groaning like the house itself is breathing. It's like someone's walking around in there, moving about in the dark, and always they head towards that back door just beyond my office. The strange thing is, no matter how fast I go check, there's never a soul in sight, even though that door's locked up tight by nightfall. I've learned to sit tight in my office, with the door sealed shut, whenever I hear those footsteps meandering through the house. Usually, whatever it is, or was, leaves me alone, like it doesn't mind my presence. Until this one night. I was reading in the office when I heard the footsteps, but hadn't closed my office door yet. As I lurched forward to close it before it passed, it was too late. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my open office. With my clammy hand on the doorknob, I held my breath as whatever it was loomed in the darkness inches from me. As my eyes scanned the darkness, I sensed I was breaking some unspoken rule, altering our peculiar understanding. The rule was simple, and I had broken it. Never look. But like a gruesome car wreck, I couldn't look away. I heard it veer away toward the back door and watched as the locked doorknob twisted. The door swung open, and relief washed over me. I felt like I'd avoided something catastrophic. I could hear my breathing again, and I stepped into the darkness to shut the back door. But again, I couldn't resist that urge to take a peek. I quietly stepped onto the porch, looking into the darkness of the night. There it stood, right at the entrance of the corn maze, among the pumpkins, and the friendly scarecrow was this figure, shrouded from head to toe in an old beekeeper's getup. I knew it wasn't human, even though it was covered head to toe. It seemed to know I was watching, and it turned to face me, flickered like a ghostly image on an old TV, then, without warning, started gliding towards me, moving in a way no human could. I scrambled back into the house, slamming both doors shut, first the porch door, then my office door, which I locked. I waited there, my heart pounding in my chest, but the house was silent for the rest of the night. Since that night, those footsteps are my nightly torment, marching steadily towards the back porch, pausing just outside my office door. I can feel a heavy stillness as it lurks just beyond the thin wooden door. The seconds drag on as I wait with my heart in my throat to hear the footsteps resume again. But every night, those steps move on to the back door. I hear the click as the lock door gives way. My office door may not offer much protection, but it's a feeble comfort during my long night shifts. I know my flimsy office door lock can't stop it if it ever decides to pay me a visit. hope that day never comes. Thanks for listening, and I hope you're enjoying my stories. Leave a comment, subscribe. Let me know you're out there.